In life there's many hills to climb, and sometimes you'll get in a bind, but the day will come that'll bring you luck. Don't live too fast, just set your pace, and when it's over you'll win the race. So hang on, friend, and keep on trucking till you reach the top. Keep them wheels rolling, don't ever let them stop. Tell old bad luck that you ain't buying, you can't fail if you keep trying. Hang on, friend, and keep on trucking.
Zach Slaton has written for the Tompkins Times, Transfer Price Index, Howler Magazine, and Forbes.com. He is the preeminent statistical analyst when it comes to MLS and EPL, in my humble opinion. I am excited to have him on the show because of all the great questions that comparison begs. He is also a diesel engine engineer, which I like even more because I'm an avid Volkswagen TDI driver. Hopefully we won't digress into that too much, but how's it going, Zach?
Great, and I am also an avid TDI owner. My wife's latest car, I finally convinced her to go get one herself, so and then we'll probably pick up a second one when I'm ready to get a second car here. So
that's pretty much what we're doing too. We've got a 2005 VW Golf, and the thing is just, I don't know why anybody wouldn't buy that car.
I've got my own theories about just bad reputation from 80s diesels that cars were using here, but certainly the more modern ones I think are a dream to drive.
So let's switch gears then to soccer quick, if we can. EPL versus MLS is the greatest starting point for about 100 conversations here. So what's your favorite differences? What are the most illustrated differences that you can? I mean, what are the ones you concentrate on? What are the ones that interest you most?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one that I constantly pick on in my own writing, my own public writing that people are used to, is just the difference in economics, player wages, the differences, and I hate to use the term disparity because it implies a bad connotation, and I don't know if it's necessarily a bad connotation, but the difference in how players, teams, clubs are rewarded and build up over time in Europe versus what we have here, which clearly is single entity, very highly managed from the top down, a lot of forced parity. And as your favorite topic to bring up is there's no penalty for failure and, in my opinion, relatively little reward for success here in the U.S. There's less differentiation. And I know Europe has its problems, has its challenges, I should say, with debt levels. I think there's certainly some concern about how the game has traditionally been, one about the people and the clubs and the supporters and how they built clubs up over time. And so I think there's some legitimate concerns about some of the economic models that have been used the last decade or so in Europe to catapult teams up the table. Certainly I don't want to tell people they can't spend money, but it's also not necessarily the usual model, which is a lot of supporter-driven with some mild investment from the owners. But to me, the most fascinating difference is how you see that disparity in wages. You see this disparity in investment. You see teams move up the table or out of another, let's say, lower league into the Premier League. And I think the most fascinating thing to me is it doesn't matter when you watch on a Saturday or a Sunday in the Premier League. I know MLS has got a lot of parity. I have my own models that show, or models that I borrowed from other people, like Penalty Blog is one of the guys out there that he goes by @PenaltyBlog on Twitter, where he has a model that shows, there is a lot more parity or closeness in the Major League Soccer, but even if you look at Premier League, it doesn't matter what the disparity is. When you line up, 11 guys versus 11 guys on a Saturday or Sunday in the Premier League, money matters, but it doesn't matter as much as we think. And you watch the up and down of QPR Man City 2 years ago in that finale, or you watch the playoff from the Championship up into the Premier League, or you watch I watched the Wigan Arsenal match last year. In the Netherlands, and to watch the despair, how hard Wigan worked against Arsenal, and to watch the despair, when they ultimately failed, Arsenal won, but you could see Roberto Martinez just trying to, struggle with his team, and they were in that match, I think, for the first 45 minutes, if I remember correctly. So there's a lot of differences, but to me, I think the passion of the fans. I got my first experience of Premier League soccer last year, and it doesn't the economics don't matter to them. What matters to them is the passion, no matter where they are in the table.
Well, I used to love to watch the Fulham Manchester United games, and I mean the wage disparity there was pretty phenomenal. But again, I totally agree. You see those two teams on the field, and Fulham Fulham held their own more often than not in the aughts. So.
Right.
That's one of my more favorite things about EPL. I mean, you talk about stratification, you talk about a team like Barcelona or Real Madrid winning every year, and when two teams take the field, at least in the EPL, I never look at one of those matches as a foregone conclusion. Maybe statistics would say otherwise, but I just, for whatever reason, I just don't do it.
They tell you it's more likely. I mean, and I think that's the beautiful thing about statistics and what you have to have. I know a lot of people do this already, but the thing that writing about this sport has forced me, and I think it's more than any other sport. I mean, the numbers game by Sally and Anderson that just came out in the U.S. That book really teaches you that more than any other game in the world, pretty much, or at least every major professional endeavor of a sport, soccer is the most luck-based. And I think that's what makes it wonderful to watch, no matter where you are in the world.
Well, I was going to say, actually, conventional wisdom would tell me that if you had a wage disparity like a Fulham v. Manchester United or a Arsenal versus Wigan in the NFL, the statistics would line up a little bit more intensely than they do in soccer, certainly, right?
Well, and it might. I would say soccer is the statistician's dream, at least the way it's done overseas. I'm a little challenged, and that's one of the biggest disparities I see as an analyst. If you go through overseas competitions, it's 38 games, 19 home, 19 away. You get a lot of they're focused a lot on symmetry, right? And to me, the other thing that I don't like is about the domestic game is the playoffs. I mean, I don't understand why you play 34 games, figure out who the best team is overall, which is still somewhat arbitrary. I mean, we've done enough numbers now to say that, like in the Premier League, it's a ±4 kind of range, and your point total can be determined by luck. So if you got 34, you could be as bad as 30 or as good as 38. That's what the 34-point total indicates, right?
Right.
But why you would do that for 38 matches to try and sort out that random variation, and then do the arbitrary, like, hey, we're going to throw everybody into a pot in the playoffs and not reward the teams that have routinely done well overall the entire season, and take the teams at the bottom and give them yet another shot to upset these guys. I just don't understand it. The North American sport, to me, is really it's a hybrid between what soccer is in the rest of the world, and then how some people have chosen to try and Americanize it over time, and I just don't get it. So
and then give them a shot at Champions League after you're done. I mean, then send them out into the world. I mean, that seems crazy to me as well. I mean, on top of the other restrictions that an MLS team has to go with, but to throw them into the playoffs and then give them a shot at Champions League when, another team might be injury bitten, or just like you said, luck might intervene, and then we're going to be sending a team down to Mexico that maybe is not the best team we could be sending at that time into the Champions League.
Well, and I agree with you. I mean, I think here's the challenge. I mean, we're going through a lot of macro issues here, but to me, the fundamental challenge for this sport is we came along after it had evolved a lot around the rest of the world, and basically had a top-down system where we had to create a league to get the World Cup, essentially. Mm-hmm. And that league, over time, has been created and maintained by people who look at the U.S. sports model as the only way to do business. And I can understand why they did it, and I can understand why they started that way. I would like to see it evolve over time to align more and more with the world's game. It doesn't have to be exactly like Europe or exactly like other countries, but it needs to fall more in line. I mean, even if we could go down to schedules, I mean, if the Russians can figure out how to play along the FIFA calendar, I think we can. I think
14 time zones. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's insane. If they can figure out how to play that way, and maximize the likelihood that their teams have to win in international competitions. Because if you look at what the Sounders did this last week, right? I know you and I have been discussing whether this is a marketing play or not, but I really think the Sounders are an example. I don't want to put down the rest of the league because there's lots of passionate fans elsewhere, but their primary goal is not just to win MLS. Their primary goal is to be one of the top clubs in the world. And if they're going to get there, they're going to need more than deferring 3 or 4 games at beginning of the season towards the end. They're going to need to have things line up so that we're playing Champions League in the heart of our season, not when we're bringing guys back in training off and on, from an off season.
Do you think the Sounders top brass wants the Seattle Sounders to be a top club in the world?
I have no doubt.
Okay.
I actually have no doubt. If you look at who's involved there, if you look at a lot of the vision, I don't doubt Joe Roth. Paul Allen is part of an ownership group that is from the Seahawks. But if you look at what they've tried to do over time, they're your atypical Seattle sports team. They don't have a world stage to really play upon. But if you look at how they've engaged fans, how they want to build up and be known as one of the best teams to come play for in the league from a passionate fan base to provide that to the fans.
Mm-hmm.
My dad's been a Seahawks season ticket holder for 15 years. And I go to at least one game a year. And that passion that's there is because the ownership group of the Seahawks understands that. And part of that ownership group is part of the Sounders ownership group and was also highly leveraged by the other owners in that ownership group that are not part of the Seahawks organization. And if you look at the vision of this, it's guys like Adrian Hanauer and guys like Drew Carey who have seen the game on the world stage and understand what it means to have passionate fans that build up a fan base over time, that then build up a club that can go out and compete with the world. I mean, it's been that marketing from day one, and it's more than a marketing slogan. It's guys that want to see the Sounders compete over time. Maybe you prefer faster than others, but certainly over time, their vision is the same end goal. I have no doubt about that because of the vision that they brought when they founded the club, and really how they've engaged the fan base here. The reason this works here, and the reason this works in Portland, and the reason this works in Vancouver is because they didn't go out and try to Americanize the game. In fact, they very clearly said this is not America's game. This is the world's game. And we are going to try and do the best we can to succeed at the world's game. And everything from recruitment of players to attendance goals that people thought they were insane to try and achieve, to the marketing even inside the city has been to challenge the world's best at the world's game.
Well, as a American soccer history buff, it's the lineage in Cascadia is one of the more unbroken over the last quarter century, that's for sure. And the way that the Sounders and Whitecaps and Timbers have hung around and tried to come back in different incarnations and struggled against the structural challenges that face a lot of clubs in American soccer and ended up succeeding and ended up bringing a core of fans with them, I think it's a testament to the depth of soccer out there, the depth of understanding, and the legacy of the game, frankly. And that goes all the way back to, Seattle doesn't go all the way back to the American Soccer League, obviously, on the East Coast, or the St. Louis scene in the 1920s. But
right.
It's still, it goes back. Kids picked up that game in Seattle as early as any in the United States. And the game was at as high a level in the 1950s and 60s as I think it was on the East Coast. But you can't sell the Upper Northwest short in that department by any stretch. But I guess the question is for me, if they want to be a world-class club, it seems like they've got to. I mean, and I give Seattle credit, and I give the Brass credit for being certainly one of the more progressive thinking groups. And I've gone back with Drew a little bit when I can sucker him into a conversation on Twitter. But I mean, do you see them chafing against the MLS structure more in the future? It doesn't seem to be any way it doesn't seem to be any way for them to get to their goal without definitely losing gigantic chunks of that single entity model. And on top of that, I would say, I mean, to bridge right into the promotion relegation debate, there's just no example of a top flight league anywhere in the world that stays closed being able to accommodate the same kind of clubs as the great clubs in the rest of the world. I mean, if you're going to give your clubs the opportunity to be the best, there's just no evidence that they can be the best in our system. So Andrew, to his credit, has gone back and forth with me, and we've actually had a little pro-rel conversation. So, I don't know, timeline, you get anything beyond, because I believe they want to get there, but. Yeah, no, I mean, I've asked Drew about this. Drew's been asked about this. I shouldn't say I have. Drew's been asked about this in public forums that I've been at, and I've seen his conversations online.
I think very clearly he is a fan of promotion relegation. I think that there is, operating in any large organization in a country where such a system is foreign. I think the team is taking, baby steps towards where they want to go, and where Drew probably sees this going, which is, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think he would largely agree with you that at some point we have to open up the spending reins. We have to open up the differentiation of the league. We have to allow teams to succeed or fail on their own. And I would say that what we're going through here is actually somewhat analogous to what England is going through. And I've written a little bit. I haven't mentioned this explicitly, but I think it's some of the themes that I touch in the background, which is this game has gotten so global and so competitive that if you look at the United States with 300 million people in it, and you look at the NFL and how they try to manage their business model, and you compare it to soccer in England with 1/6 the number of people, maybe 1/5, what we're getting to is 3 or 4 superstar clubs per country, and that's what 50 to 60 to 70 million people can support, right? And you go and that's why you have a Champions League, because you need those top 2 or 3 clubs playing against each other to sort out who the best in Europe is. And I think this is making Europe even uncomfortable because they've been so focused on their national leagues historically, right? It wasn't until the post-war era where you really got these international competitions between clubs really taking on. And I think that's part of the discomfort here in the United States as well. We have a business model in sports that if you look at baseball, football, hockey, or basketball, our national league is the only one that matters. And there really isn't. I mean, there's some international tournaments, but they don't really matter as much as playing in one of our top professional sports leagues. And I think there's some discomfort, whether it's U.S. soccer or even the average American, of trying to market the idea that we actually only need 3 or 4 really, and they may change over a decade or so, right? Things ebb and flow. Teams don't permanently stay at the top. There's a few. But even if you look at United, I'll say I think they're going to fall off their perch over time because of Ferguson being such an outstanding manager that you can't replace. So you'll have clubs that swing in decades, but I think we need to get over the fact that our leagues don't have to be the top spot to compete, especially in soccer. That's clear, and we need to get towards a model that rewards clubs that build up over time, allow them to differentiate themselves in payroll, in wages, dominate the league for a year or two. Eventually, like everything else in business, because that's what this is, it's a big business at some point. Opportunities dry up at that big club. Another club takes risks. They end up getting those good players. And over that decade, they end up supplanting the great club that's their original.
And for me, it's about market size. I mean, our market size seems to be... when people go out there and throw out Spain and Scotland as examples of why we shouldn't move to a different system or promotion relegation, it's like we have 25 Glasgows, we've got 13 Barcelonas. I mean, the market size here, it just seems to me that, first of all, the promotion relegation system doesn't necessarily result in incredible stagnation, but even if it did, our market would seem to be able to break that down like no other country. I mean, perhaps we're set up for it more than any other country in the world. I mean, investments can come and go in different cities. Clearly, there are soccer markets that aren't being reached all over the country. New York, Miami, 2 great examples in my humble estimation, where folks are out there, watching the European game in droves and not paying attention to the domestic game because they simply, in my estimation, they're sophisticated fans and they're taking the best thing they can get instead of some other form of soccer, some hybridization, like you said about MLS. But
yeah, you could. I mean, the way I've thought about this is, I actually think our country needs to be viewed a lot like a mini Europe, and I don't know if we look at promotion and relegation if we have to have one massive national league. I think one of the things that actually makes playing in this country difficult is recovery time, muscle injuries, things like that and the number of games that you play in and how physical they are. May predicate having some regional leagues or some sort of, regionalization where you have more opportunities, where you have an MLS East and West, or, hate to use the term MLS because that's not only way to do it. But I think we need to think about how can we create a system that rewards good teams, allows teams to build up over time, focus on supporters. To me, that's the biggest benefit of the leagues that you see overseas is supporters have a hope of moving up. If you build a great team in the League One or League Two or the Championship, you move up and you can try and compete, and you don't have this ceiling or a floor imposed upon you. So I think we need to look along those lines and figure out, as the sport is continuing to build here, how do we continue to grow the game at the professional ranks? Because I will say the thing that Clint Dempsey does coming back here is, I think there's been some really good articles about how people can say what you want to offer them is you don't have to go to Europe to compete at the best levels. That's what we're really talking about, is how do you make U.S. professional soccer grow over time to compete with the best leagues in the world? And you want to have those examples of great players playing here. And that should be the end goal. And I think actually some sort of increased opportunity, whether it's promotion and relegation, whether it's regionalization of the game so that you can serve those other opportunities. Because it really is, you can't have a 40-team league. You can't even have a 32-team league. I'm really concerned about, Garber talking about going to 22 or 24 teams by 2020. I mean, we need to get away from this idea that we got to be like the NFL, where we only have half the teams play each other, all the time, and then you rotate through other conferences. This is insane. We need to come up with a system that allows everybody to have some good opportunities and allow great teams, frankly, teams that have great support like Seattle, to take all that money they're generating and not wait 4 or 5 years to spend it on two big designated players, which I love them, but 2 players do not make a team. They should be able to spend that on every single player on their team and raise their level of the entire team across the board.
I mean, that's the question for me and Dempsey. And I've had this argument a few times on Twitter. And how can I want to give Ziggy that money and say, build, make the Sounders as badass as you can. And Dempsey's great, but I don't think there's any way you can argue that money spent on Dempsey will have a commensurate effect, the same kind of commensurate effect on team performance, frankly.
No.
And it's not that I love Dempsey. I mean, I'm an old Fulham fan. I've done, I take nothing away from Dempsey in this argument, but I mean, and Eddie Johnson and I got into this a little bit on Twitter too. I mean, the wage difference there is it couldn't be more absurd. So
yeah, you and I have talked about this, and I still need to write up the article. But I think one of the challenges that you pointed out is the DP rule was interesting, and I know what the league was trying to do. And most people, I'm not going to be original when I say this, but I think the Dempsey thing really is starting to point out how absurd the rules for allocation are inside the league. And you and I have talked about this. I think it really biases compensation.
That got crazy really fast. I mean, there were the Twitter buzz around that. Even Steve Goff was questioning the league there. It was like, wait a second, what's going on here? I mean, you guys are opening there between the expansion and Dempsey. They opened so many cans that week. It was the biggest week for promotion relegation chatter I've ever seen on Twitter. I mean, it seems like and this would be a great thing to ask you statistically, but I've never seen the promotion relegation chatter as high as it is right now. Yeah. And even, I love Google Trends, and I've been on there, and you can even start to see bumps in that. And frankly, I'm so proud of American supporters for taking those two situations. And generally, you find these spikes in promotion relegation interest on Survival Sunday in the United States. But it's the second Garber started talking about 24, that was the biggest spike I've ever seen. And it was like one of those moments where you're like, Americans really get this. I mean, they understand where this league is going. And I think what you and I are saying is shared by more people than perhaps we even recognize.
Yeah, so there's 2 things I wanted to hit on here. I think that the pro-rel discussion that you've seen spike is really it's going to be tied with transparency. I think what most people are starting to get really interested in is the league and the sport domestically. I mean, it's been growing by leaps and bounds, and as you pointed out, international viewers, because you want to watch the best athletes in the world, right? So you'll watch it over in Europe. But domestically, the professional game domestically is taken off to a point now where I think you shine some more sunshine, you get more eyeballs on this, and people are going, wait a second, now why do we even have an allocation draft order if we're just going to bypass Portland, or why did Toronto just say, hey, look, it's better for the game. It's better for the game. Forget our fans. It's better for the game if we don't even try to bid on this, right? That's the impression I get. And so what the pro-rel debate is about, and what these questions about the allocation order and how Dempsey came back and why are we going to 24 teams is all about transparency. And I think that's the biggest challenge that MLS has right now, is that they've been like any American professional sports organization. You and I have had this discussion. And I think you've said it's a little bit different with the other pro sports because they have such a hegemonic operation when it comes to getting the world's best talent. There is very little worldwide competition for them, so maybe
and no worldwide competition, and they're regarded as the best leagues in the world more often than not.
But they still, I will say, as a Seahawks fan and watching the NFL, I am extremely uncomfortable with how much Goodell tries to do this top-down management. And to your point, here's what's beautiful about European soccer: the leagues don't matter. The only thing the league is there to do is to stage the competition and negotiate the TV rights, right? Nope.
It's a container. It's just
that's
a container.
all it is. And there's minimal power structure. They largely let the clubs sort out most of this stuff, and only when you have some disciplinary issues like I hate to pick on him, especially since he may, although it looks like it's a long shot, may become an Arsenal player. The Suarez type issues, the Terry type issues, those get some, and even then sometimes they go outside the league and go to the judicial system, right? So that's what I want to see the model in the United States. I don't want to see the NFL brand any more than is required to stage the competition. Just like I don't want to see MLS brand any more than what is required to stage the competition and to support the clubs that should be there. Now, the final comment I'll make: what is telling, if you read the commentary, now I'll be accused of being a homer, I'm sure, but if you read the commentary coming out of the Sounders organization about why they made this move and why they made the move for Obafemi Martins, is the undercurrent that I can tell you I was feeling as a season ticket holder here, and being around since they, unfortunately only restarted in 2009, they were feeling the pressure. There is a very passionate fan base up here, and I will never say they would abandon the Sounders, but I will say that there have been a lot of people saying, we got 38 to 40,000 people showing up every match. When at some point are we going to be able to Sounders? That's where it was directed at first. Sounders organization, when is that going to translate to us kicking the crap out of the league every week? Literally. There's a lot of you. I mean, you hear.
No, I try to stir that. I try to stir that up from the outside, and I know I get myself into trouble doing it. But I'm like, come on.
Well, hear what Adrian.
Get upset.
Hear what Adrian Hanauer and Joe Ross said. Right? Why did they go out and buy Martins, and then why did they go make a move for Dempsey? It was because last year they said they finally got fed up with having great, mediocre to good seasons, and having every team has ebbs and flows, but especially the last couple of years where they would finish reasonably strong, get into the playoffs and struggle, and especially against LA, right? What did they say? They went, they finally got their first win against RSL, and then they went and played LA and got their clocks cleaned. And they said the reason, the reason was that they have better players. So they know the pressure they're facing from wanting to be the best club in the world, but I also think there's this very intense pressure up here from the fan base, which if you look at our history, we passionately support our teams. But when you're the Mariners and you stink year after year after year, screw you guys. We're going to leave the ballpark and we're not going to show up. I mean, my wife is a passionate Mariners fan. When she was growing up, she played softball. And we can't bring ourselves to go watch those games now because it is very clear that the management team just does not care about putting a quality product on the field. So I will say that I don't know how quickly they can change the rules in the league. I think they're going to evolve over time, and they have to, unfortunately, work within the system right now. But I have no doubt that I think the Sounders organization and a few others in the league are really pushing and forcing the league in areas that are uncomfortable. And I actually think, too, that you can see this in some of the fan reactions. I mean, you've seen some of the reactions that we get online and in the press about our fan superiority complex. Yeah. That's good for the league. Why else would you not want fans that sit here and say, granted, if somebody says we invented soccer, it's absurd, right? But why wouldn't you want to say, damn it, we're the best team in the league. We're the best fans in the league. We have the most passionate fan base. we should be allowed to clean everybody's clocks in the league if we can put double the attendance in there. Especially,
I mean, that support should be able to be used as freely as any other club in the world. I mean, and I think that that's important to maintaining the entire thing. I think at some point rests on that. And I guess that's another question for you at this point, to throw that in there. Do you think the Seattle fan base recognizes that the Sounders are under unique limits vis-a-vis the rest of the world? Or do you think they accept it? They think it's part of the growing process? Or do you think they don't know?
No, I think so. We got to, with any team that has, double the attendance of the rest of the league, I think you have to, there is no one typical Sounders fan, because I will tell you, if you come up, I don't know if you've been up here, but if you come up here, there's a certain amount of there's a certain amount of bandwagoning going on here, right? I mean, this is there's a popularity thing going on here. So if you take some of the people that are maybe not as passionate and you move them off, I don't know if they're fully aware. I mean, I go to matches all the time and I hear people chattering around me, still learning about the game, which is great, but they're just not aware of the worldwide scale of the different rules and different business models and club versus national team and things like that. Mm-hmm. I certainly believe that the people who are writing about the team, blogging about the team, podcasting about the team, know where we stand versus the rest of the world. They know the business model that MLS has is very different. There's a range of opinions from, we got to prevent this from becoming the next, we ourselves have to not be the next Cosmos that end up spinning the league into oblivion. There are some opinions I've heard. There's other ones that are, I think, far more incremental. Some of the ones that I've seen you debate on Twitter / argue sometimes would I think, not necessarily disagree with you that they want to see the team be rewarded for its passionate fan base and the opportunities that should provide. It's just a question of how we get there. And I will agree with the basic premise, which is there still needs to be a viable business model for the league itself. I don't know if I'd necessarily be as conservative as the league has been in the salary cap and a few other things. I think there's other things that the league has done over time now that make the salary cap unviable and the rules in its current form. I mean, if you look at the amount of money going to DPs versus, your average run-of-the-mill player, you could pay those average run-of-the-mill players a lot better, and I think it would be a bigger impact to the quality of the product on the field.
I don't think Eddie Johnson's run-of-the-mill, but he's being paid like run-of-the-mill.
Yeah, no,
I mean, stuff like that.
No, and Eddie's been quite vocal the last week or so, and Obafemi Martins too.
I know, it was nice to see Oba jump in on his. I mean, that was. I hope Clint. I hope if he speaks up on this. I mean, that just seems to be one of those. That would be an incredible statement, and maybe he's crazy enough to do it.
And I don't know what the team is looking. He's not crazy. He's going to tell him. I mean, nobody's. This is. I will say this, and I hope I don't get myself in trouble. I don't know Obafemi Martins, and I don't know Eddie Johnson, so maybe they don't care what my opinion is. I'm questioning why they're on Twitter stoking this fire. I will say, as I've worked for several large organizations, I don't think your best tactic is to remind your employer very publicly that you think you're underpaid. And nobody in the Sounders organization, I would believe, thinks that they're going to keep Eddie Johnson on the pay scale he's on right now after this contract. It's a lot like the Rosales situation a couple of years ago. Frankly, Eddie was in a position where he had to find a team that could help him rejuvenate his career, and the Sounders got a good deal for that. In fact, they got one of the players that they had to give up to move up in the allocation order. They got back, and he's a contributing member of the team, Lamar Nagel, right? So I think the Sounders came out way ahead on that deal. It's very clear, and they will consider rewarding Eddie versus the other options that they have. I just don't know if it's the best tactic to go out publicly on Twitter and retweet every single Tom, Dick, and Harry that says, the obvious, which is Eddie Johnson should be getting paid more money. The structural side of the league, Eddie certainly is one example of being a great player that's underpaid, but I'm also concerned about the average run-of-the-mill player making 30, 50, 60, 70K. When you take a look at all the money these teams are pouring into DPs, very clearly teams are spending money on players. They just happen to be concentrating in a very few. With
not to mention development.
And development. I mean, you could go across the board where all this money could be possibly better, in my opinion, better spent, a little bit more equitably spent. And I don't have a problem with a league if the beauty of the Premier League, or not so much the Bundesliga, but a lot of these leagues around the world that aren't centralized, is you can't point to the league and say, you know what, the league screwed this team or that team, or the league set up a structural rule that biased all the money into 10 players or 20 players, right? The fundamental challenge with MLS is, and this is why sport's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be simple. It's not supposed to be like a 400-page regulation to conduct the sport profession.
And 17 drafts and a re-entry draft and a draft every other week.
When you make it needlessly complicated, you get all these interactions that have unintended consequences that end up setting up, bad incentives. It's just like when you get these really complicated, arcane financial structures that you allow people to exploit, you have all these problems of money flowing one direction, which is maybe not optimal. And so I think one of the challenges for the league, and they're going to get into this after the next season, right? Because the collective bargaining agreement is up with the union. And it's going to be really interesting to see how the union and even USL and some of these other, there's been a lot of ideas thrown out there you could do a quasi-pro rel if you get more partnership with USL and NASL and try to promote teams in and out of that, and maybe come up with better support structures for them so that disparity isn't, all the money isn't flowing into MLS coffers per se. So they really do need to work on this. But overall, I'd say I think the fan base, to go back to your original question, the fan base up here really is diverse, but the most passionate certainly know that the league rules need to evolve over time, and they need to be set up so that, especially in a league that has minimal TV revenue right now, you need to reward the clubs that are putting the butts in the seats.
Now, for me, as an old DC United guy, I see the danger for me is that you create. Hold on.
You had an MLS team you actually liked?
I was a season ticket holder at DC United.
Sorry,
it's shocking. I don't know why I did it.
Sorry, you had an actual question there.
But what I saw with DC United is that there's this conveyor belt of fans, and everybody's transitory, and part of that is DC being transitory because people come in and out of DC quicker than they come out in and out of MLS. But like you're saying, a bandwagon. It seems like in DC, what happened is a lot of these people got in and they believed MLS was shooting to be one of the best leagues in the world. They believed that DC United was shooting to be one of the best teams in the world, and then they ran into that wall. And I don't know that a lot of them recognize what that wall is, whether it was institutional, whether it's systemic, but they just said, wait, then all of a sudden that stops, and then there's all these other teams, by the way, that I've learned about while I've become a DC United fan, and then I've moved on. And I don't want to put my stilted worries on Seattle, because I think that, like I said, the culture out there is deeper, and the Sounders tradition is deeper, and the Cascadian tradition is deeper, but do you see that as an issue? I mean, will fans start moving out?
That's been my number one concern since they started the club was, you go to a Husky football game, or University of Washington Husky football game today, and seats are empty. They used to pack them in there, and the seats are empty because the product was bad. And we told the NBA to get lost when they tried to hold us hostage for a new stadium that they wanted us to pay for after we had just built them we greatly refurbished this basketball arena for them. And we told them to get lost, not just because of the financials, but because the team had stunk for several years. Mm-hmm. The only one that I have not seen this happen with is the Seattle Seahawks. And my family's been here for 20 years, right? So the only team, Mariners have done this, where they took off. I was here for the 116-win season. I went to several of those games. They were rocking affairs. Several years later, now a decade later, people aren't showing up to the games. And it's because the fans here are sophisticated enough to know when they're getting fleeced for money. And about the only one that hasn't had this happen was the Seahawks. And part of that's because they only have 8 home games, and you can pack people in there pretty easily when you only got to fill 8 home games at 70,000 seats. It's what's that, 500 some odd thousand. You can get 500,000 people to go to a Seahawks game in a year. But even then, there was a lot of worries after they had that run in the early 2000s. By the late 2000s, when they weren't doing very well, there was a lot of worries that fans were going to stop showing up. So I will say we were very excited about how quickly the Sounders took off, how, that as you said, the undercurrent of soccer fandom here was huge. The Quest Field was actually the way they got that built, or now CenturyLink. They had to pass a bond measure, and that was publicly voted on. And the only way they could get it, literally the margin of error in the actual vote, could come down to the fact that you had soccer fans, a few percent of soccer fans that voted on it because they promised to design the stadium as a dual-use venue where they would put the sight lines in and the construction of it so that you could use it for soccer. Because back in the mid-'90s, late '90s, we were saying we want a stadium to attract an MLS club. So you have that undercurrent. But I will say there's a reason why the Sounders ownership group has gone out every year and kept pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing for more and more talent, and shipped out when they've had problems with Freddie Ljungberg in the locker room, when they had problems with Blaise Kufo, when they've had problems with guys not performing like Flacco, they ship them out and they get new guys in here because they know that they don't have the long-term status of the Seahawks, and they've seen what happens when you don't perform. So my concern, yes, is if you look at any league that's especially closed, and you look at MLS's history, you could single out DC United, you could single out New England Revolution right now as two teams that have some structural issues, have some stadium issues that I think are preventing some of their ability to rebuild the fan base, because it really is, with, again, no national TV contract, the stadium is even more important, the atmosphere is more important. But you look at this ebb and flow inside MLS, and I think we should be concerned up here in Seattle about eventually we will, I call it the NASCAR effect, right? NASCAR does this too, where their cars get too far out ahead, and NASCAR loves parity. They love the wreck at the end of the race and the closeness. Mm-hmm. So they steadily tell you, oh, no, you can't change your engine design that much. Oh, no, you can't change your body design that much to reel you back into the pack. And eventually, just through attrition, and I think, league rule changes and things like that, that might happen to Seattle up here. And I really do question, even if we're 10 years in, I'll probably draw a lot of heat for this, but I'm sorry. Prove me wrong, Seattle. I love this town. I've lived 8 different places, and I wouldn't live anyplace else. But we have a track record of when our teams really start to stink, attendance drops. Now, it may only drop from the 38,000 down to 28, right? And most people would kill to have 28,000, but the trend is what matters, and that will be an alarm bell to the rest of the league if they start seeing attendance drop off here.
Well, I mean, what concerned me from the start was, and you've heard this too, I'm sure, that they kept referring to Seattle, the phenomenon, as a honeymoon. It was like, really? Like, I just heard Garber and these guys using that word honeymoon. That's one of the things that got me, that sends me over the edge.
I didn't hear that, but if that's the case, it's been one heck of a 40-year.
I know.
It's been one heck of a 40-year honeymoon with this sport, because if you talk to anybody up here,
I mean, the Kingdome opens to Pele and 70,000, 68, 58,000 fans. Yeah. I mean, that's a great story. It's just, it doesn't work. Okay, let me ask you this final question then, because we're way longer than most of these shows are even supposed to go, and way longer than most people even listen. So, and you know a little bit about the structure of MLS. Can a team ever get out of MLS? I mean, can you see the mechanics of that?
I don't know if they can get out of MLS per se. I think the way if it does happen, that it would get forced is kind of the way that England and several other countries have done it, which is you get a cluster of big enough clubs that are, because you can make an analogy to the old way that the English leagues were structured, right? The Premier League was basically built upon the idea that there was a number of clubs that said, look, if we want to compete with Europe, we need to get more TV revenue. We need to modernize our stadiums. We need to modernize our clubs. We need more revenue. And we're not going to get this in the current league structure. And so they broke away, maintained things like promotion and relegation and largely still follow the sport, but they broke away from the old structure. And I think that's what you're going to need in this country is you're going to need enough clubs to grow big enough to challenge the league structure. And then it's up to the league to figure out, do you want to stay MLS? Or do you want an American Premier League that says, okay, forget you guys, we're going to break away? And there's probably more legal wrangling that would have to go on. I mean, I think you talked about this yesterday on Twitter, that you could do things like pay the franchise fee back plus an exit fee to get out of MLS and do that. But that's the way it's going to have to happen. Clubs are going to have to get big enough financially, and the league will do its own maneuvering to try and keep that from happening so that they're always in control, because that's the way American leagues behave.
Right.
But that's the way it's going to have to be. Clubs like Seattle, clubs like Portland and Real Salt Lake, who seem to clearly have ambitions within the wider continental competition. And I'm going to anger some people by leaving them off. I'm sure. I'm not trying to single you out. Those are just the ones at the front of my brain. Are going to have to threaten to break away. And then you force the issue with MLS and you get a negotiated settlement of what either the league continues to be or a way to exit the league. And I think when you say exit the current rules of the league. That's why I'm saying I don't know if you have to exit the league, but you've got to eventually grow into a point where you change the rules and exit those rules and get more to a system that's more aligned with, I think, the rest of the world.
Can you ever see salary caps working in an open system?
No, I don't think so. I think salary. So the way I make the analogy is soccer is probably one of the few sports in the world that's a lot like international business, and just like international, we found it very hard to put a lot of regional or national rules on how we govern international business. It's going to be very hard to write a salary cap in the U.S. or in the UK. I should say England or Germany, and not have the best talent leave there for someplace else that can pay them more money. I think what you need, and I don't know how you do this because it gets into regulation and it becomes very complicated when you do this to enforce these regulations. Maybe UEFA financial fair play is one way to look at it. Maybe some sort of increased revenue sharing is one way to look at it to keep teams from doing some really absurd stuff financially. To create monopolies, but I don't see a salary cap working. I just don't know how, if you're going to compete against the best in the world that don't have salary caps and are allowed to concentrate talent the way they are, you can do that. I think we need to move beyond. We are not competing nationally. We're competing internationally, and you need to look at a multitude of business models to be able to do that.
Obviously, for me, I want to stir up trouble in Seattle, and frankly, as one of the guys who stirred up Eddie Johnson, I'll take credit for that. Do you think it's? I mean, can a player talk about the structure? I mean, my goal wasn't get Eddie to complain to the Sounders that they're not paying him enough. I was hoping, first of all, didn't even want him to respond to my tweet. Honestly, I didn't think I didn't expect him to do that. But I think the players. It feels to me like the players can say, there's a structure. And Thierry Henry did this a little bit a couple years back, saying, there's no way that Barcelona could make a transition into this MLS system. You'd have to lose 5 significant players in order to get there. And he touched on it directly. And I think some of the players could stand up and say this. I don't want to involve the players in this because I know that talking about promotion relegation is a third rail for a lot of people out there. And I think I would like to keep players out of this as much as possible. But I think they do play a little bit of a role. I mean, can't they be a little bit activist on this?
I think they can. I mean, first thing Eddie's a very vocal guy on Twitter. So if you send something to him that is of interest to him at all, he will tweet back at you. That's I think it's interesting that he does that because he's one of the more vocal players I've seen out there. I think the players do need to be active. I think the union needs to be active in this. I think there's a wage disparity, funding disparity, development disparity question from their perspective, and then looking around at the team, who they surround themselves with and what the quality of the team is. I will say the advantage that you have is that you're somewhat of an outsider. The advantage that I have is I'm somewhat of an outsider. I don't owe anybody anything. I'm not getting paid by anybody. I will say this is my afternoon job, my evening job, my day job. My employer would be pretty pissed if I came out and started critiquing them very publicly about how they pay me, what pay scales. I mean, they would. So I understand why the players and I understand why people inside MLS. It's just a basic power structure thing. They need to change it from inside, and they need to do things occasionally publicly, like where the clubs or the players threatened to go on strike before what was supposed to be a great season. I think it was in 2010 or 2011. They pushed that CBA up to the brink, and they got some okay concessions there, and they are going to need to do it again. This is a basic power structure thing. They're never going to get anything that they don't ask for and that they aren't willing to push for and occasionally go public. I just think that there's a question of tact and how frequently you go public and what issues you go public over. So,
yeah,
we'll see what they say.
I do not want to drag these. I mean, I try not to drag. Hercules Gomez has been somewhat vocal with me and a little bit with Eddie, but I think I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but again, it's like for me, it's finding some way to get this structure under the microscope and and get it looked at. And sometimes I just think it's not being recognized for the impediment that it is, obviously. And let me just ask you one more thing, and I swear I'll let you go.
No problem.
I think it's really obvious that if we were to go to an open system, that lower division clubs would see an unbelievable influx of investment and interest, and something that would, when people talk about our lower divisions being in too bad of financial shape and not drawing enough interest, and when they are able to do that, then we can think about promotion relegation. And I tend to turn that argument around and say, well, if you float this out there, if you build the right kind of transition, you're going to flood these teams with investment and interest that they didn't have beforehand. And I think Bill Peterson is picking this up with his recent comments on promotion relegation and NPSL as well. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that paradigm?
Yeah, no, I somewhat agree with you here that I think if you look at what Manchester City was willing to pay for New York FC, if you look at all these interest groups that are lining up in Miami, Orlando, different places that are willing to pay a franchise fee. If you're willing to pay a franchise fee, right, of $100 million, $75 million, $50 million, there's money. There's money and interest out there. The question is, do you want to make that a fee that you pay a league that then gets redistributed to the other clubs who are allowed to tell everybody else who can compete at their top level and who can't? Or do you want that money to come from supporters to build a team up over time to if it's not a closed league, if it's not a guaranteed return on investment, maybe Manchester City doesn't come over and pay $100 million for New York FC. But maybe you find other investors who don't pay $100 million, but invest $5, $10 million in a second level team to build them up over time to then get promoted if you had promotion and relegation. And you actually increase opportunities. I will leave on this thought that this sport and most sports need to not be about the people who run them. And as Drew and Adrian and those guys have said for the Sounders, it's not about even the club executives. It needs to be about the supporters and the players on the pitch and the supporters who support them. And we need to get to a system that those people are rewarded for their investment of their time, money, and effort. And we need to not have these arbitrary barriers, because when you do, to your point, I don't think certain clubs or certain people even try because they feel there's a barrier. And if they felt there wasn't a barrier, they would be more likely to invest and build this sport up in the lower divisions, and you would have more organic growth. And you certainly wouldn't have the Manchester Cities coming over here immediately, but you would grow into that over time, and you'd have a lot more opportunity for second-tier clubs to be what they want to be, which is outstanding clubs that have opportunities to grow.
I don't think Sheikh Mansour bats an eyelash if the league's open in the United States. I think he got the bargain of the century at $100 million for the only top-flight club in New York City. That's number one. I don't think he paid for. I just don't think he paid for MLS protections, and he may be groundbreaking in that. The second thing is, with the rise in the promotion relegation debate that I've seen on social media, I've underestimated the sophistication of the American fan, and I think that I think we get promotion relegation. I don't think it's a foreign concept, and I think, judging by the push for it after this expansion and everything else, I'm way more optimistic than I was a couple months ago. But that's probably a good way to end. I don't mean to end on my pontification, because I appreciate you being here, Zach.
No problem. Thank you very much. And I'd encourage more people to talk to Ted on Skype. I know sometimes they can get into arguments with you on Twitter, but it's been a fascinating conversation. And I think we find that there may be more to agree upon than disagree upon. And ultimately what we're concerned about is improving American professional soccer and giving it hopefully the same opportunities to achieve things at the global level as what other countries and clubs have.
Keep on trucking till you reach the top. Hey, keep them wheels a-rolling, don't ever let them stop. Tell old bad luck that you ain't buying, you can't fail if you keep trying. Hang on, friend, keep on trucking. I say hang on, friend, keep on trucking. Just go on and hang in there. Keep on trucking.